let's kick it off. I'll set the tone a little bit, and then we can kind of get into questions and go around. But the whole summit is about exploring ways to inspire change. And us as creative entrepreneurs, that's a huge part of what we do every day. We try to influence people's thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and motivations in order to increase their quality of lives in one way or another. And all the big and little ways we do this, in my opinion, are forms of storytelling. Introducing people to something new by painting a picture of the world we want to live in. And all of you are incredible storytellers, and I'm excited for you to share your methods and inspiration, because I think this talent is really powerful. And the more people who hear about it, the more people who master it, the more people who can get others to fall in love with what they love, and the more clearly people can see what's possible, the more change will actually take place in the world. Also, selfishly, I'm just fascinated by each of you, your vision and your storytelling style, and I want to hear about it, and I want to hear you talk about it. So like I said before, I have a number of questions that I jotted down that you guys have seen most of them. Those are meant to guide the discussion, but I welcome any and all questions from everyone watching also. And we can kind of go around and see what sort of rhythm unfolds. So if you don't mind, if we could go around and start by introducing yourselves by telling us kind of who you are, what you do, but more importantly, why you do it. And Marc, since you're on the top right, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks. Marc Maleh. I work for Huge, which is a global design and technology company based in Brooklyn. For the past year, I've been based in Vermont. I run technology with a specific focus on the emerging space. So I do a fair amount of work on virtual reality, augmented reality, and storytelling through those platforms. I think, to kind of answer Aaron's question, like, why do I do what I do? I enjoy kind of like making things. That's my biggest, my background is like, I'm a maker. And sometimes that making thing is, a piece of hardware. Sometimes that making thing is a film, sometimes it's a website. It comes in a lot of different forms. And I like kind of learning new things that you can make and how to inspire teams to think about how they want to make interesting content or interesting products with those things.
Excellent. Thank you, Marc. Danial, do you want to go next?
Yeah, my name's Danial Stricker. I have a company called DP Immersive, and we work with cultural storytelling in immersive and I guess new media. We have a couple projects that we've been working on with Aaron, one of which is called Shifting Homes, which is a climate change VR piece that's going to the Venice Biennale this year. And I guess we're trying to work on bringing new media and storytelling to people that might not necessarily have access to those technologies, but who have amazing cultural capital and stories to tell.
Cool. Thanks, Danial. Ara.
Yes, my name is Katz. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of a company called Seed Health. We work exclusively in the invisible world of microbes. So obviously, if we had this panel over a year ago, I would have a lot more explaining to do. But I think we all know the power and potential of microbes, particularly after a single one. I think changed our world probably forever, or our lives forever, over the past year. I work in the ones that do good, and we develop novel applications of how you can use microbes for both human and environmental health. And so that's everything from probiotics for humans, probiotics for honeybees, probiotics for coral, and live biotherapeutics for really large unmet medical needs where there's actually no primary standard of care, and starting with women's health, and that will kind of expand over time. And one of our hopefully what we're known for and one of our superpowers is how we use this microbial world as a new lens through which people can make choices and changes in their lives, and a way to shift perspective and kind of give people kind of a new way to see the world around them, find more connection, I think, to the natural world, and certainly find new whys for how they make decisions and choices for their health.
Amazing. Thank you. And briefly about me, my name is Aaron, and I believe in the power of our sense of smell. And I want to harness that power and kind of weave it into the fabric of our lives, just like sight and sound is. I first became obsessed with our sense of smell early in my career as a chef and a sommelier, seeing the effect it had on people while they ate and drank. There's just something, a very simple thing that people do every day, but people also often pay exorbitant amounts of money to do it and have very, very intricate experiences. And since 90% of flavor scientifically comes from smell and not really taste, I was fascinated by that and fixated on that. After a number of years, I was introduced to the flavor and fragrance industry, which is the $300 billion industry that almost no one has ever heard of, yet they influence the average person over 30 times every single morning before they even leave their house, in the form of some sort of like consumer products and goods. And that led me eventually to starting my own kind of like punk rock-ish style small flavor and fragrance company that helped other small unique brands tell their story through smell. And eventually I had the incredible opportunity to start OVR Technology with a wildly talented team that developed the first ever olfactory virtual reality platform that is now being adopted in a number of applications, everything from stress relief and relaxation to training for high-risk occupations like firefighting, police, and military medics. The first thing that I would love to, for each of you to articulate is, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, but go a little bit deeper into what is the storytelling medium or mediums that you use. I think there's the obvious ones that, we have, websites and branding, but are there any more subtle or more non-obvious mediums that you use to tell your story? Ara, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I think when I heard you say website and branding, I think, we think that, the medium is the message. I think we've learned that. I think Marshall McLuhan said that in the 70s. And I think particularly with now with all the ways we kind of interact and the greater surface area, both digital, virtual, physical, I think that there's so many more narratives kind of coming at us in all kinds of kind of conscious and unconscious and more passive versus active ways. And so, brand and website, I mean, you have to remember that a website, even just by itself, whether it's being consumed, what device it's being consumed on, impacts and, the moment that there's so much context around even like a website, depending on what device you're on, where you're looking at it, the time of day you're looking at it, obviously, the orientation, and of course other things that are, if it's obviously iPad and even like iOS versus like Android. And so, even just like little things themselves that you think are not storytelling opportunities, do like that kind of empathic design to also understand like the medium's not just the website, but it's also like the zoom out of like where is it being, that narrative kind of being exchanged. And so we think a lot about not necessarily like all the new, although we think about a lot of new mediums. No, actually, like and Dan, actually, while you were talking, I was like, oh, we have so many things we could talk to you guys about. But we are exploring some of those really, I think, new mediums, and some of the stuff I'm sure that Marc will also talk about too. But something we really love to do is think about what someone might expect from a specific medium, and then use that for storytelling in a way that changes the way they would see that medium. So like a really great example, which is a really small example and not as maybe technically exciting as what Dan and Marc do. But for example, we pop up these like science courses on Instagram, and we use the highlights as a way to take people from like the serialized kind of coursework. So like every day we drop a new highlights that allows people to go through learning science. But what's interesting is that zooming out, Instagram is a platform where like egregious misinformation and like politicization of science happens. And so for us, we're like, how can we use it to actually become a science education tool? And then furthermore, how can you use the highlights as a modality for like event-based and time-based drops of doing and gamification, whereby going through a science course, you can be rewarded for that curiosity after those days. And then of course, use it to elicit all kinds of like feedback and interactivity during those days that you're kind of like popping up, even something as simple as like a science course. And so that has like, just as one example, I think one of the things we love to do is shape shift a little bit the way people sometimes think about how they would typically engage, or put more friction into something where they're used to having no friction, or change the way that they might like, that just scroll is very different than like saying, I'm going to wake up every day and like learn science on this medium where I typically just like watch people make smoothies and like, do ceramics. And so, which by the way is also beautiful, but it's fascinating for us how we like to think in audio and smell. And I know, Erin, we've spoken to you guys. I think I come from media, so I think we're always trying to figure out, what are those little ways. Even we were talking about something recently, like with press releases too, like what if you just announced a new word every day in a sentence on the PR, on the newswire, right? Like just the idea of countering and using some of those things that are meant to feed 24-hour news cycles, but like slowing it down, that if you literally just said one word every day, like what would that look like? And I think a lot of the stuff we do, particularly around health, where you want to put friction in, is something that we really try and think about.
I have a follow-up question for that too, is, so you use the word friction, which I think is like the perfect word to describe the increase in effort it might take to kind of push through the barrier where people are used to. And I love this idea of simple contagion and complex contagion, where like, if you're just trying to like tell someone about a new pair of pants, they already have a concept of what that is in their head. But when you switch that on them and you try to push a new concept, it takes a lot more momentum to actually get that across. So how do you, from a business perspective, as well as a creative perspective, how do you decide where to kind of burn calories, knowing that doing that is going to provide a more powerful outcome, but it's also going to take a lot more effort?
I mean, the truth is we do try and think about like where we do have a number of internal kind of mantras. One of them is that friction is the future. And I think that we've seen post-industrialism, I think we've seen the faster and faster and scale easily is not the answer, right? I think that's a big take home from this conference too, right? Like, and yes, there are moments where you want to just be a point of utility and you don't want someone to have to work for something. For example, like in customer care, like if someone needs to do something, you really want to be of service in that way. And so I think a lot of it is like, you really have to employ some, kind of human-centered design, empathic design, to understand why someone's coming to you in that moment, and decide, is this a moment that you want to educate? Is this a moment that, it's like when, if you ask your friend, like, you text them a very quick question, what time are we meeting? They'll be like, okay, so what I hear from you is you would like to know what time, at the end of the day, sometimes they just want to hear 3 o'clock. And so I think you need to, that's a skill and a muscle that I think is earned. But I would say as a brand, we put friction in places because we do believe that if you just take a second and learn, we use the IKEA furniture model, right? Which is that the relationship built when you put the bookcase together yourself, despite what the bookcase cost, and your time probably was more than the bookcase's actual value. There's an experience and memory and association that is different. And now we're starting to see that being proven with science, which is how you learn. Like there's a great study recently about kids that learn science through a musical versus in like the regular academic environment, and the retention of microbiology research, learning it through the musical was far greater. And so I think we really it's not just friction, but it's actually what I was saying earlier, which is it's also what is the medium for that friction and how is it being served up, right? And I think that, I think we all look back to like 6th, 7th grade, classes, and we're like, God, if we could all as storytellers redesign the way some of those subjects were taught, would we be here doing what we're doing? Because it would have made some of those other things like, wholly, I think, feel different in terms of their inspiration for us. And so that's kind of the way we think about it. It's really like where, when, why, and being judicious and know where we've earned permission to put it and know where we want to be of service.
That's really, really insightful. And, you know, we deal at OVR, we deal with a lot of those questions on a regular basis too, scent being something that people don't really pay attention to unless something smells really bad. Or they're like trying to pick out deodorant or perfume, you know, but it has this role every time you breathe in and breathe out. And, you know, so when do we educate? When do we bring it to the surface? When do we let it stay in the background? As a question we ask ourselves every day. Marc, I'll pitch the same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about, you know, what we call like a unified brand experience. And it's like the medium is actually like very secondary, right? So if you're doing something on Instagram or you're doing something in your e-com site or, you know, in VR or whatever it is, really, like the end user should always come first. You know, everybody talks about that, you know, but at the end of the day, you also have to make sure that the discussion you're having or the content you're producing is hyper relevant to the platform you're putting it on. So, and sometimes that means choosing not to be on a certain platform. You know, so maybe a certain message that a certain brand wants to put out there is incredibly relevant for Instagram, but not so relevant for LinkedIn. And you have to think about that. And some of that has to do with like media selection, but some of it, frankly, also just has to do with like the narrative and the content that you're putting out. I think when you're getting into the experiences, whether it's a product experience, an app, a website, a VR experience, AR, whatever that product is, you know, it's a very similar, I would say, game where that unified brand experience has to come through the whole thing. And I think we've all probably had experiences where, you know, maybe you see a TV commercial and then you go to the website and you're like, is this the same company? Like, they were talking about one thing over there and now I'm over here. And like, yeah, I see that product that they were talking about, but like nothing looks the same. The tone isn't the same. And that's really where I see like failures from like pretty big brands out there where like your end user is just uncertain of like what you believe in and what you stand for, because you're telling a lot of different messages across a lot of different platforms. So I think like, you know, when we're working with our clients, that's a lot of the story is kind of like, let's first think about what you're trying to express and then worry about how we're going to express it across different channels.
And since, Marc, you work telling other people's story as well as your own a lot, what do you feel like is the most challenging medium that you've ever worked with when trying to communicate someone else's story effectively?
So I think all the mediums have different challenges, to be honest. I know it's kind of like a non-answer, but like they all come with different challenges, right? I think one of the things that is always a little bit of a challenge is actually educating your clients on what they should and should not be doing. And frankly, some of it comes down to like definitions of mediums. I think, you know, using a lot of the work that I do across like, you know, mixed reality and AR and stuff, it's like those terms they're not new for people who've been doing it for a long time. But I think for a lot of larger organizations that are just starting to dip their toe in the water for some of these types of experiences, like they're using 1,000 different terms and really unsure of like what they're talking about sometimes, to be honest. And a lot of our role then becomes like education, right? Like, okay, like when we're talking about AR, this is what we mean. And guess what? This is why it's relevant for you. This is why you should invest in doing an experience on this platform. Here's what it's going to do for your brand. And I think the challenge of the medium comes almost at like a much later date when you've actually kind of expressed the why, and frankly, a lot of times the why not. And to me, you know, we get briefs from our clients, right? And they'll say, this is what we're trying to position ourselves. This is a product we're trying to sell. This is a campaign that's important to us. And to me, what a lot of times, if those briefs actually say a medium, like we want to do augmented reality, I'm usually like, Well, let's dig into that. Why? Why are you picking this medium? How about we come up with a great story and a great idea and then see if that's the right medium? Because guess what? Yeah, I'm like the bearded nerd in the room who should be pushing you to do AR, but I don't want to do AR for the sake of doing AR. Like, I actually want to have a meaningful reason for you as a brand to do AR. So I think that's actually a little more of the challenge, frankly.
Yeah, I think for us too, I would say also on a daily basis, because we work in scent, and the part of your brain that processes scent has no capacity for processing language. So trying to communicate even the most basic information we were talking about scent is really difficult. And the go-to, I think, for a lot of people is this kind of what they think they want, so, oh, I want the smell of the beach, or I want the smell of green apples. And then the question, why? What is the outcome that you hope to achieve by communicating that through in a chemosensory way? That's kind of like where the conversation starts. Where they think the conversation ends is where the conversation really starts, because there's a lot of digging, into your point before, about trying to like get to what people's why, like what are you actually trying to express here? I feel like that's not thought through enough. Like, what is the end goal, and what's the action that you really want people to take away when your story is told? Daniel, I'm not sure exactly when you dropped off, but the question up right now is, what is your primary storytelling medium? And you touched on it in your intro, but if you could dig a little bit deeper into, you're in immersive technology, but also in music and art as well. So.
For sure. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, and sorry, my connection dropped out for a sec. I guess I started off in music. My background was traditional music, so that would have been my original storytelling medium. And I guess through that I could see kind of the magic that medium like music could bring in terms of empathy and connecting emotionally to a theme, a visual piece, what that might be, and how you can kind of use visual mediums to enhance that, or other senses as well, to enhance that through originally like through music videos and then through new media. And that's kind of how I got into VR. So like immersive mediums, or using immersive technologies, and be that any sense. I guess my purpose is always through this kind of like empathetic medium. So like, what can we do with the story using this technology that you couldn't necessarily do in another way? And how can we really connect with the audience in that way? And that's kind of how we got into the stories that we have been exploring so far. Basically, it's like, how can we really like hit home, and to us, like VR, AR, especially coupled with working with yourself, Aaron's, with smell, and trying to bring other senses into those stories, is kind of what we're about. But yeah, I think anything that can really add to that story, and again, my background's in music. I think it's almost like the last frontier of magic. How you can get someone in the audience to really forget their day to day, and really like come with you on that journey.
Absolutely. So the next question is like a little bit gratuitous, but I also think it's like a fun, important one. But I want to talk about bad storytelling. I just like to, sometimes it's easy to frame. Sometimes it's hard to frame good, and framing bad makes it a little bit easier. And I know that all of us encounter bad storytelling on a regular basis, especially, Ara, like you said, on Instagram. It's a lot of really bad storytelling on Instagram and Twitter. But I would love, maybe just a quick snapshot of like what would constitute bad storytelling or failed storytelling, either from someone else or yourself, or what's the danger of it not working? And Marc, let's start with you this time.
So I think like, there's so many examples out there of brands, and I won't name any specific brands because I love them all. But like I think like there's so many examples of just massive failures on Twitter or Instagram where like they put a tweet out, and I think so many people are just like, how could that possibly have gotten by their like team of social media and marketing people? Like, there was one recently on, from a fast food chain on International Women's Day that I think just blew people's minds, where it was just like so insensitive. It was supposed to be tongue in cheek and just like ruined them for the day. I mean, like, and I think the consequences, we've seen consequences ranging from, obviously just like everybody bashing a brand for that day. How could you do this? This is terrible. Articles on Mashable and CNN. And then you go on the bigger side is like massive revenue implications and people boycotting your brand. And I think, to me, where those failures from like a storytelling perspective happen, like as somebody who has, run social media campaigns and worked with teams of writers and strategists, it's always so confusing to me because I'm just like, did one person either A, just not have the guts to maybe speak out and say like, guys, have we thought about the other side of the connotation around this tweet, or did it just fall flat with everybody and nobody really thought about maybe the negative implications of content that wasn't really thought through? I also think a lot of people talk about, like diversity when it comes to the teams that are working in content development. And, that's so incredibly powerful of a utility, because if you have people from diverse backgrounds thinking about the content that's going out to the masses, what's offensive to me might not be offensive to Aaron. And at least you're getting people from different backgrounds together and saying, well, people might think about it like this. So I think there's a little bit of like a, how are people actually producing content and with what type of teams, but then also enabling employees at an agency or at a brand, to feel comfortable speaking out and feel comfortable saying like, hey, like we shouldn't put that out there because this could be the ramification if somebody takes this in X way. Yeah, that's my kind of quick take.
I was actually thinking about that Burger King story when I asked the question. And I think that like, it's really hard for big organizations to say genuine and authentic. And I think the second you start sacrificing your like kind of honesty and authenticity is when the storytelling suffers. And, I still cringe when I think about it. I think it was like a Pepsi commercial. It was like during like the commercial was during a social justice protest, and someone like goes up and hands riot police a Pepsi. It was just so fucking tone deaf. Like,
and this is where I think there's a difference though between like authenticity. I don't authentically think Pepsi was trying to be offensive that day, right? No. Like that's not what they believe in. Like they're not. What they were really trying to do is they're trying to have tension, and they're trying to seize a moment when everybody is talking about a thing. And to me, they seized the wrong moment, and they were part of a conversation that was not relevant to them. Yeah. And they did it in the absolute, like you said it, tone deaf way, right?
Yeah, it felt a lot like pandering and insensitive to me. And, and I think that they suffered from that, brand wise and financially wise for a little while. Ara, would you like to tell us how storytelling has failed in the past or could fail?
It's funny because I like a lot of my I was thinking a lot about while you guys were talking, because I don't often think of like bad or good. Like I do think that there's of course like masterful storytelling, but I do, one of the things that we always like, unpack, at least from the perspective of, you imagine that most of these things are, particularly if it's coming from a brand, or just a bunch of like humans sitting in a room, right? It's not like a brand like this, like monolith. Even at the biggest companies, like you meet the social teams and you like can't believe actually that it's like two 24-year-olds like figuring it out sometimes, like who like talk to the comms team sometimes. And so, you know, I do think that, you know, there's certainly a lot of insensitivity, and I think this, I think failure is, to me, like I come a little bit more from like the health perspective, which is not just human, right? It's the for us, of course, includes the environment and much more like the One Health philosophy. But you know, if you look at climate change and COVID, I think those are like extraordinary examples where if there were masterful storytellers, you know, like Marc and Danial sitting in the room at the CDC or the WHO, like you can only imagine like how some of the language and the visuals and the ways that these messages would get communicated, but more importantly, like they would be understanding that certain ears and in your case noses would be like sensing these ideas so differently. And there would be a way to like much more empathically like understand who you're talking to. And you can just take like masks as a great example, or vaccines as a great example, where like these are huge failures of storytelling. And there's a beautiful quote that Marc Wolpert said, who he was a scientific advisor in the UK to the government, and you know, he said science isn't finished until it's communicated. And I think that we actually forget that so much of our, you know, so many things and decisions that we make in the world are like these little narrative points that permeate, and depending on how they come in, we synthesize them into, of course, our worldview. And I think the greatest tragedy of really all storytelling, left, right, red, blue, any sides you want to kind of create, is that, you know, they're one of the, you know, I think there's this propaganda, to me, is a great failure as a format, if in a lot of ways, because, you know, I think that it deeply understands what it wants to communicate and get somebody to do. And I think that the weaponization of these formats, and that is, of course, becoming even more eerie as digital technology becomes so efficient at fabricating moments. Of course, there's the beautiful ways to do that Marc and Dan do, but there's also the other side of that. But what all of this has never allowed, which is why one of the reasons I like the framework of science, is that there's no possibility within all these frameworks and ways of pushing things out for like confirmation bias to be questioned. And of course, in science, it's peer review. And certainly you wish inside a company there were more people checking the tweets. But that notion of peer review, like Marc's point, is like, then it depends on who's peer reviewing. And I think that there's like this lack of, I think it's very easy for people who just who like probably agree, like particularly who are self-selected for like this conference, who probably have like a very similar worldview. And I think what happens is that there's no formats where like that confirmation bias can just be checked in a way that actually creates like shifts, and it can be heard and integrated in like really meaningful ways. And I think that is one of the, you know, when everybody can publish every thought and idea and externalize even their internal experience, such that it's no longer there's no border. You don't have the time to synthesize like your own ideas, kind of what we were talking about earlier. Like there's no if you're talking about what you're doing all day and you're only consuming what everybody else is thinking and doing, there's very little time in the way that these stories make their way out into the world, no matter how good or bad the storytelling is, to ever synthesize like your own opinion. And so it becomes this like amalgamation. And so in some ways, like it's not bad storytelling, it's that the way I think that it's much more that like and again, the mediums and the messages are now the same thing in a lot of ways. And I think the way we're consuming all of these narratives does not allow for us to then create our own. And I think in some ways that to me is one of the bad storytelling. And I think we've seen that play out particularly with regards to like really urgent issues, like things like something like COVID or climate
And I
change.
completely agree that it's really like critically important to make time and space for yourself to absorb and synthesize all of these sensory inputs that you're being bombarded with, so you can kind of create your own identity and your own opinions. And I think a lot of us that are either rooted in science or we're science adjacent would love to believe that the data and the science is enough, right? It's enough that it can speak for itself and that will influence people's thoughts and behavior, but that's patently untrue, right? You know, I don't know if this extends beyond consumer behavior, but we know that 95% of consumer decisions are made in the unconscious mind, and then rationalized using the kind of framework that we have, our worldview. And so like to your point about propaganda is really effective at targeting people's emotions and playing on people's emotions and getting them to make decisions and actions and, you know, adopt concepts that might not be rooted in science or data at all. And I think one of the most beautiful forms of storytelling is being able to get people excited about data and science. Marc, you do a lot of like data visualization in your work, which I think is incredible when you can take a data set and turn it into an interesting story. You know, I know everybody or almost everybody loves Malcolm Gladwell, but I think one of the reasons he's so successful is his ability to take data, raw, big data, and synthesize it into stories that people emotionally get behind. And they're like, yeah, I see myself. He brings people on the same side of the table as him. And then once he, you know, we are armed with that kind of level of understanding, then that turns into self-image and behavior rather than just a, you know, a flash purchase or a thought or a tweet or, you know, something like that's very, very like kind of ethereal, just kind of evaporates. And Danial, for you, to your point too, I think maybe bad storytelling, not the right word, but ineffective storytelling or missed opportunities.
I think what Ara was saying was really interesting about how basically just, you know, like these days storytelling is so much, you know, about like fake news. And I think that really just pushes, you know, to me that's kind of like in a way that is essentially, in some ways I think it's like the worst storytelling, but you also have to look at it like it's just so sensationalized and so crafted that, you know, like, and the way we consume it is just so, you know, we take everything for fact. I think that's just the dangerous kind of world that we're in at the moment. And I found it recently, you know, I was telling you the story where, in my week, this week's been really crazy with this flood incident that I went through. But, you know, one thing that happened here was like, as soon as we arrived on the bank of this, we finally got to the shore like an hour after this incident happened. There was just a line of media and like just photographers and TV and all the TV stations. And what happened this week was like all these stories came out, and it was like nothing to do with what actually happened. It was like a puff piece for the emergency services who actually didn't do their job very well. And so as like the person that the story was about, we were like, wow, this isn't accurate at all. And like it just made me think of like, you know, it's like we jumped on these boats in the first place because we were fearful, because of these stories that we've been reading about, you know, what was happening with these floods. And I feel like we just live in this like everyone's just trying to feed us fear. And so for me, like good storytelling would be like, how do we create stories that aren't all about fear? Because it's just, I feel like everything in the media with the, you know, obviously with COVID and you know, lots of different issues, I feel like it's just very fear driven. And to me, that's very much like an easy way to get people to like connect with your story. You make them feel scared. And you know, even with some of the pieces we do, like with climate change, like this shifting homes piece, like there's one moment where it's like a fearful scene, you know, and in an immersive technology, when you actually feel like, I guess this is on another tip. I would say this is good storytelling, by the way, but like, you know, you're thinking about how to connect with those people's emotions. And if it's done in a positive light, I think that's, you know, that's great. But if it's negative and it's for like, you know, other purposes, and like fake news, I think, it's not great. So yeah, I think unfortunately that's something that we've got to really check in with, day to day. And yeah, I love how you went there, Ara, as well. I think to me that answers the question.
And I think that's a good segue too into the next question, which is, I think that ineffective storytelling can be one directional, can be one direction sometimes, but I think good storytelling it takes two directions, right? So you have to kind of understand who you're telling the story to, and you have to have a degree of empathy and compassion for them, and want to get this message across to them for their benefit, not just your benefit. And so, that kind of triggers the question in me for all of you is, who are you telling the story to? If you were to describe, who you craft your story for, and of course the answer is like it's often very different, and different channels kind of reframe that story. But if there were a persona, what would that look like? Paint that picture. And to something Ari said before too, is it's easy for storytelling, especially with social media, and general media, is to become caught in an echo chamber where everybody's telling the same story to each other and kind of confirming each other's existing bias. And it's not lost on me that 3 out of the 4 speakers here are white guys with beards. But if we can, if you could describe who you're communicating to, I'd be really curious to hear you describe who you're storytelling to. Daniel, do you mind starting?
Yeah, sure. I guess the one thing we think about when we're approaching a story is, for example, if we're working with like a Samoan community and it's a greater message that we want to get out there, like how climate change is affecting this village, we're thinking of like, number one, how can we get this message across to a greater audience outside of Samoa? But we're also thinking like, this is an authentic Samoan story, and it's very important for us that whenever we're working with someone, it's like, how is this going to translate to the audience here in Samoa? So just keeping in mind for us very much that, as you say, like, like it's with like in this panel, there's 3 white dudes with beards, but at the same time we're working with these like very important cultural pieces that obviously I'm learning a lot about as we kind of collaborate and work on these stories, and just trying to make sure that the lens is very authentic and accurate for the piece, rather than like my story, because not a lot of the time it's not my story. Like that would be a separate thing on its own.
It totally makes sense. Marc, would you like to follow up?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you said it. It's like kind of depends on what the story is and those types of things. But like, I feel like a lot of times, I'll talk to people on my team about like, will our moms get this or our dads, right? Like, especially when I was doing like a lot of data visualization work, like, you shouldn't know you're looking at a piece of data viz for it to work. Like your first reaction when you see it shouldn't be, that's beautiful data viz. Because if you're saying that it's data viz, then you probably actually don't understand the story that the data is trying to tell you. So it's like, I would always look at things like from that lens. Like if I showed this to my parents who are not savvy and who are older, like, would they actually get this? And I think I still, to a degree, even think about those types of things depending on maybe like the product that I'm working on or the piece of content that I'm working on. Like if my mom would ever be the user of that thing that we're making, like, would she really quickly understand how to use it, right? Or is she going to question the usability? If she's going to question the usability, then like, a lot of other people are going to be in a very similar boat. So, I think, it's, I guess, like a way of kind of saying like, to a degree, you almost have to think about like, not that my parents are completely tech illiterate, but like your lowest common denominator, right? It's like, if you're trying to communicate to a really large group of people, like, you know, a user base of millions and millions of people, you have to think about, you know, on one hand, maybe the most savvy, and then on the other hand, just the absolute simplistic version of getting the point across. So I think it's getting a good cohort of users to kind of understand what it is you're trying to do, really. And I think if your cohort is really just focused on one side of that spectrum, then a lot of people, I think, will be pretty disappointed.
Yeah, we have an interesting way of kind of like segmenting populations, because in one way, a business standpoint, we have to segment populations and be like, okay, who is our buyer persona, right? Who is going to purchase this equipment? But the end user, you know, for our like medical relaxation product, for instance, it's a series of virtual nature environments and breath work and meditation to guide you through this experience. And the idea is that it's relaxing. And there's a degree of familiarity and like fantasticalness that has to take place in the sense, you know, when you see a forest, everybody has a different perception of what a forest is from their childhood. So what we're trying to do is trigger olfactory memories that live in the limbic system of the brain. But since those olfactory memories are completely subjective, what we have to do is kind of search the bell curve. We have to understand the chemical components that make up a forest in Siberia, that make up a forest in Germany, make up one in Australia, that make up one in North America, and look for through lines and look for kind of chemical through lines and be like, okay, now we think we've identified the kind of the top of the bell curve of what people would subjectively identify as, that's the smell of the forest. I remember that triggers a sense of safety and comfort and familiarity for me, but it also smells really good. It's also got other elements in there where the idea of the forest kind of lives in there too. So there's a bit of art and a bit of science. And so it's really, really difficult, especially when you're kind of like crossing, segmenting from a business standpoint, segmenting from a creative standpoint, and trying to dig into people's like childhood memories in order to identify how to reach them and how to tell the right story to them to get them to that emotional place as quickly as possible.
I also think, like, to your point, like, this is where technology excites me when it comes to storytelling. Like, in one regard, like, there are so many different capabilities right now to understand the user that is viewing a piece of content that you put out there in the world. Similarly, there are ways, really interesting, exciting ways, actually, to dynamically create content. And being able to know, like, oh, these are the segments that you are communicating with, and being able to dynamically and drive a personal piece of content or a personal experience to that person, I think is very exciting. I think there's also a balance, right, around, like, is it useful and exciting, or is it creepy? Like, that balance is always something that we talk about, is making sure that, like, we're being useful without actually crossing the line into creepiness, right?
Oh, it's a fine line.
It's a very fine line.
Yeah. Ara, who are you telling stories to? And I guess maybe I should add into this question is, like, maybe who you would like to be talking to directly.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's like the previous recovering filmmaker in me that, and storyteller, and that like starts to think that this is really like some of the debate between, like, art and design. And so when you start, calling humans users, and we start getting into the cohorts and segmentation, it's marketing, right? Like, yes, we can call it storytelling. And I think that, of course, that is at its essence. I think some of the best marketing feels that way, but marketing is to tell something with the idea of eliciting, like, a transaction, or getting someone to ideally do something, feel something. And so I think sometimes I think the distinction, I always talk to my team, because there's, of course, the, like, very self-awareness that we sell something, and we'll probably sell more things. And also, a lot of what we do is not directly to sell something, but as a company, like, that is a part of, like, what we do. And I think one of the things, like, we try and unpack a little, and I think actually I'm grateful it wasn't in our DNA, because I'm not a, I don't come, the world calls me a marketer. I don't didn't think I was one, but I've, when you realize, like, when you are telling stories with that, there's a very fine line, of course, between, like, what I was saying earlier, between, like, marketing, propaganda, art, design. Like, it starts to really, like, when you're saying that you're doing something to elicit a behavior, I think those are some of the constructs that have gotten us to this place as, like, humans and as a planet. And so one of the things that we try and undo a little bit is some of the ways that, like, a lot of people will say that, like, in science, when you didn't get to the right answer, you have to look back from a first principles perspective and say, did you ask the right questions? And one of the things we try and do is we go back at the beginning of doing any project or whatever, is we really, like, work on the questions that were, like, I guess the analog being the hypothesis. And one of the things that we're really not good at, by the way, is, like, who's the user? What are, like, in fact, in 4 years of building Seed, like, we actually don't have any of that, which is now kind of getting into some of that as we're starting to understand that particularly as we're scaling and launching new things, that will become increasingly important. But I think there is that fine line between user data and using data to inform everything, and, like, Steve Jobs, right? Like, there's a moment where, like, you have to say, like, I'm building my own planet, and I'm doing it because this is why, something I believe greatly in, and I believe in the mission. But I think sometimes, like, the reason I'm hesitant to say exactly who it's for, and I can tell you, like, I think that the people that we care about, but I think the people that we care about today already care about the things that we care about. And I think we're really interested in how can stories, I think you guys were saying this a little bit, like, how can stories now reach humans that wouldn't have actually come in? Like, how do you find a door for them to walk through? Because I don't think that it's hard to get the people that would attend Sea Change, and then in those, like, small concentric circles out. That's not where I think, like, real change is going to come from. I think real change is when someone would initially look at you and be like, whoa, you've talked about vaccines, like, cancel you. And then find a way for, like, that door, a door for them to walk through. And so, like, a lot of times I'll respond directly. A good example recently is, like, if you ask me who I'm talking to, it's the woman who, like, DM'd us talking about, didn't like that we had talked a little bit about Luca, which is, like, the last universal common ancestor and, like, the beginning and origins of life. And she loves our brand, but she's very religious, and it's not where she believes, like, life started. And I wrote her an email, like, that said, like, we don't have to, like, agree. There's, like, a point, there's a Venn diagram of agreement and disagreement, but that doesn't cancel one, or, like, that doesn't mean you can't participate in our brand, and doesn't mean that you can't ask questions that would allow us to think about ways of communicating to people like you differently, and you can't ask questions of us to say, have you thought about this? And while that's our framework, it doesn't exclude you. And so I think that, we deal with this all the time, because there's really the people who are, like, the diehards, like, Seed's amazing, you guys do all this cool shit all the time. And then there's the people who are like, no, I just, like, actually have never even been on your Instagram, and I have IBS, and, like, I actually can't live without your products, and I, like, literally have no idea what other cool stuff you do. And I just wanted to arrive on time. And so, like, so and then you have people who are like, fuck you, like, Bill Gates is the devil, and vaccines are, like, a weapon of mass destruction. And so, and then you have people who are like, like, thank you, in ceremony, I thought about Seed, right? So you have, like, literally, like, the dichotomy of humans. And so I don't want to say it in a grandiose way, but, like, we try and speak to as many humans as possible. We just think about the door, that who do we want to walk through which door at which moment, and how do we meet them, and how do we serve them there? And in moments, how do we not serve them at all and serve ourselves? Because I have a team of humans, we're not just, like, we're not, like, automatons. Like, there's 40 humans that, like, we want to do things that are fulfilling for ourselves too. We're artists, we're creators, we're scientists. Like, it's not always, like, for an end user that's sitting in, like, a deck somewhere that, like, I can be like, oh, look at the levers we pulled, and, like, how the ROI of this. Like, ROI is also, like, a group of humans who, like, love working at my company and are like, I get to do things I would never do anywhere else. And through that, they then get to do other cool things that sometimes are a little bit more data driven. So I don't think it's like I think it really is, I hate to say, it's very hard to control C, control V, across like every story we tell and why we do things. But I'd like to think one of the things I'm very proud of is that we go back to the questions that we start with. And I think that first principles allows my team to say, wow, I like never would have like tilted my head and just looked at it this way. And we really try and not drink our own Kool-Aid. Like that's the big thing. Like at the end of everything, we look at this, like, are we drinking our own Kool-Aid? Like, like we can't assume we have permission to do all of this, and we can't assume that it's the cool, just because we think it's the coolest thing doesn't mean it's the coolest thing. And so I think that hopefully, I know it's a shitty answer because it's not like, well, we speak to like 20 to 35-year-olds who are like living in urban areas in like the United States, Australia, and the UK with like a little bit of like Switzerland. It's like I think that sometimes that we try and like undo some of those assumptions so that we can actually create better things, but not because we're not considering those things, just because maybe some of the ways we have to start creating is to think a little bit differently about the way those things are inform the stories.
No, I love that answer. And the answer I was looking for was not the, males 24 to 30, it wasn't a like ideal customer persona exactly, but it's kind of like who are you sharing this dialogue with? And so Danial, I'll put that to you.
Sorry, who are you sharing? You mean like?
Yeah. So if you were to kind of characterize who you're telling your story to, like who do you want to get through to, what type of, behavior do you want to change, or minds do you want to change? Or, who are you speaking directly to, or who would you like to speak directly to?
Okay, for sure. Yeah, I think specifically for the stuff that we've been involved with, a lot of it is like, what actions really are, like, I'm going to flip the question a little bit, like what actions do we want to get out of people, and therefore who do we want to talk to? And so, for example, like if it's a climate change piece, it's like, well, obviously it's like the individual and their day-to-day practice, but also opinion leaders, influencers, politicians, like, can we get this piece across someone that's going to be able to make a decision that's going to impact this significantly? And then if it is just, like, how do people change their day-to-day activities? Not only are we targeting this type of person or this type of person, but like, what is that action going to be if it is that, audience member? But I think, yeah, for us, it's just really trying to get, it depends on the story and but like, one example was we were trying to get our piece to the, onto the stage at the World Economic Forum at Davos. And, there's lots of filmmakers, storytellers, or there's one in particular, another VR creator called Lynette Woolworth, who actually did present at Davos. And it was interesting because it's like, you don't really see sometimes these filmmakers across these big economic forums. It's not really like the forum you'd expect a filmmaker to be presenting their stuff. We'd probably usually submit to like Tribeca or Sundance or these kind of like institutions, but to actually make a difference, I think those like forums are really important. So it's kind of like straddling that line between those two arenas.
That makes sense. I think we're on our last few minutes of the lab. So for the last few minutes, I kind of want to put it to all of you. I mean, the theme of the summit, right, is sustainability and climate change. And so I think we've kind of all had that like in the back of our minds during this discussion, or at least I have. And, I think that that's one of the big challenges of fighting climate change and creating, sustainability, is telling the right story. And I think everyone at some point kind of touched on that idea. And is there anything else kind of in that category, in that theme, that you want to share before we sign off? whether it's like a business initiative or an idea or someone you're working with, just anything that I may have missed in the questions. There's probably like a zillion questions that we could have got to, but we didn't. But I'm just wondering if there's anything you'd like to share before we wind it down. Marc, you can start.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, Huge as an organization, like we're fortunate that we can say no sometimes. And there have been times when, clients that we didn't necessarily feel like met maybe environmental or, ethical considerations. We've said no, like, sorry, like we can't work with you because of this unless you change this. And I think we're very lucky to be able to do that. But I think part of the reason why those types of things are so important is because you have to also think about your employees. And like, if you as a, we are a brand, right? Like, and if we as a brand are gonna, work with an organization that we feel a large percentage of our employees might be uncomfortable working with because of environmental or ethical concerns, that's going to have a ripple effect. That's going to have a ripple effect on the quality of work, the culture of the organization, which then will trickle down and have a financial impact. And I think we're kind of always thinking about those things, and we're not just thinking about like, oh yeah, like let's go work with that person. It's like a little bit more like, should we? And I think that's incredibly important when you put a lens of your employees and your teams and on the type of projects and clients that would excite you to work with. You do better work when you're passionate about the organization you're working with. And I think that's something that I like to kind of instill in a lot of people that I work with.
Totally agree. Thank you, Marc. Danial, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think just working within this space is, important, and there's lots of stories out there to tell. I think that's maybe what I'd like to leave it on. Like there's so many voices out there that that haven't been heard and can be heard within this new framework, this new world, and I think and it doesn't have to be like, we can create like very engaging, entertaining pieces, and so for me it's just trying to find those voices, and I learn a lot myself on that journey, and hopefully everyone out
Thank
there
you.
will too.
And Ara.
Yeah, I mean, I really echo what Danial said. I think like this past year, more than anything, I think we've seen like the disparity between our experiences and the people who get to hold cameras and the people who get to have brands and the people that get to speak at conferences is such a small glimpse actually into like our more collective narrative. And I think it's I think it's just important to know the limitations of the stories and the channels and mediums, and of course like the propaganda and bad information and bad storytelling and all the things that we've kind of seen play out over I think the last year, and certainly not just in this past year, but certainly illuminated in the past year. I think just really show us that there's like really big systemic things that are predicated on dismantling, I think, not the systems themselves, but all of the assumptions and ideas that went into them. And I agree with Dan. I think just what we're talking about today, of course, is, a very non-diverse group is so limited in terms of the stories that I hope we have access to. And that is one of the beautiful things about technology, but because it of course can democratize who can hold a camera and who can get something with the press of a button out to millions of people for the world to see. But I think even within that, and while that sounds like a great idea, I think we aren't seeing enough of that. And I'm not sure that the way the algorithms are built allow us to in the way we understood. And so, I think in a lot of ways, I think it's like the people who have the most privilege, it's our responsibility to think about, what are some of those frameworks for sustainability, and asking the right questions, and like thinking more systemically in the things we do. And that starts with everything from conference programming to who you follow on a social channel to, and I think that there's very little iterative things, and I think there's zero to one stuff. I think to Marc's point earlier, like it really a lot of times depends on who's sitting around that table as we tell these.
I really echo that, and a lot of the little challenges and the big challenges we face, even things like trying to implement a circular economy where we rely on our customers to send the thing back to us, which seems like a small ask, so we only have to make something once, is unbelievably challenging, and can be kind of disheartening because people don't want to do it, they don't do it, and the kind of the pressures, the economic pressures to to ROI and produce profits, it can be really difficult. So sitting in this panel with the three of you who are excellent storytellers and successful and using your powers for good is very refreshing and energizing. It definitely gives me, a lot of energy to keep pushing forward and keep doing what we're doing and thinking about things and challenging ourselves in the right way. So thank you to all of you and everyone who showed up to watch the talk. This was excellent.